Welcome back to Ring of Fire. We're talking with CIA spook John Rizzo, who's just written a book about his 3 decades at the CIA, company man, 30 years of controversy and crisis in the CIA. Let me ask you to respond to something about an idea about American history. During the Revolutionary War, George Washington, when the British were torturing American soldiers and officers and killing them by the dozens daily in prison ships in New York Harbor, Washington was asked by some of his officers about torturing British officers who had knowledge that could have helped in the war effort. And he was so repulsed by the idea that he said it would be better for us to forfeit our cause than to sully it with behavior that would reflect poorly on our democracy and our nation. And he meant torturing people. And he treated the Hessian soldiers so kindly that he had captured on New Year's Day that they walked voluntarily without guards all the way to prison camps in western Pennsylvania, and many of them ended up staying in our country. The same thing happened during the Civil War. Abraham Lincoln was so aghast at suggestions that they torture Confederate soldiers that he ordered protocols created for the fair treatment, humane treatment of prisoners of war, and that ultimately became the Geneva Convention. During World War II, President Eisenhower said that, again, even though the Nazis were torturing our troops, that we weren't going to do that. We're going to treat them as we wanted our troops treated. And during that war, thousands of German soldiers surrendered to Americans because they had heard from their fathers who fought in World War I. Always surrender to Americans because Americans don't torture people. Now, isn't that a legacy we should be proud of? Isn't that a legacy that we should try to sustain?
Sure. No, it is a legacy to be proud of. But when we're talking post 9/11, Bobby, we have to keep in mind the kinds of people that were our enemy here. These were...
But let me interrupt that because you've said that 3 times. And, I don't believe that. I don't believe that we're in any more danger today than we were in danger in 1780 when, Washington's troops were barefoot, they were bleeding, they were walking in the winter, and our country had lost almost all of the battles, and we were about to be defeated. And he still refused to torture people. During the Civil War, our country was split in half. We almost lost that war. There were 660,000 Americans killed. It's the same as if 6 million people were killed today. During the Cold War, which I lived through, people were building bomb shelters. We were, one person could have pressed a button that would have annihilated the entire human race. We were in much more danger then than we were after 9/11. But 9/11, you had a government that wanted to frighten the American people, to hype up the danger, and to tell us there's never been a danger like this before in history, so we have to do these extreme methods. If you actually looked at history, real history, we were in much more danger in other times in our history, and we didn't engage in those kind of measures. We did sometimes, but it was always an aberration. It was never by policy, and that really is what distinguished our 9/11 behavior and has now, brought us disgrace across the world. What would have happened if after 9/11, instead of launching this war against the world, the intelligence agency said that the best way for us to improve security and to reduce the threat to America, to humanity, to improve quality of life in our country, to improve public health, to bolster our economy, and to restore our national prestige is to get off of oil? What if that was the report that went to the president? Oh, let's not get into wars. Let's get off of oil. Because after all, Osama bin Laden bombed us because we put troops in Saudi Arabia, at least this is what he said, after the first Gulf War, which was an oil war, which the first President Bush said this war is about protecting our interests in oil. And so what if we just got off of the oil? I mean, the oil, our addiction to oil is, we are funding essentially both sides of the war against terror. And we're giving people in the Mideast not only resources, but reason to look at us as the great Satan. Let's get off of it. Let's stop buying their stuff and let's switch to, American energy production. What if the intelligence agencies had said that, and instead of looking around the world for trouble to get into, had come home and said, let's look at the feasibility of transitioning to solar, of transitioning to wind, of ending our dependence on the foreign oil that's getting us into all this trouble. Why isn't the intelligence agency giving us that kind of intelligence? Are they capable of giving us that kind of intelligence assessment?
Oh, sure. If that were their assessment, then that's the assessment they would have given. I honestly cannot accept the proposition that the 9/11 attack but was driven by our oil policy. Or, if we had come out on September 12th and said we're renouncing oil and we're going solar, I mean, do you honestly think that would have deterred bin Laden and his people? I mean, they had issued a jihad against the Americans everywhere.
But Osama bin Laden said that the reason that he was targeting, his original target was the king of Saudi Arabia. That's who he spent his life fighting against, and he hated Israel. He was battling against the Russians. He was battling against the Saudi Arabian crown, and that's where his fixation. He began to fixate on the United States, according to him, and maybe you have information that this isn't true, but according to him, because we stationed permanent troops in the nation where Mecca is located. And he believed that having foreign troops in the nation of Mecca was an unforgivable crime and that we had to be punished for that. That is what his story was. Now, if you know something different, that would be good for Americans to know, because otherwise, and why did we put our troops there? We put them there because of oil. And that, there was the first President Bush, when he went to the first Gulf War, many Americans, including my uncle, challenged him and John Kerry, and said, we are against this war. We are not going to give you a carte blanche to go into to protect Kuwait, which is a repressive, monarchy, from an adjoining repressive monarchy, which is Saddam Hussein. Why is this even our business? And President Bush said, this is our business because the protection of oil pipelines in the Gulf of Hormuz and the Persian Gulf is a U.S. national security issue, and he called that the Bush Doctrine. So it was an oil war. Nobody disagreed with that. And because of that oil war, we left troops in Saudi Arabia to protect the Saudis from Saddam Hussein. And because we had troops there, according to Osama bin Laden, that's what infuriated him and caused him to bomb the World Trade Center. So did the CIA ever put together that chain of events and say, wait a minute, instead of spending $4.3 trillion on a war, why don't we spend $500 billion getting off of oil and building a national grid in our country that could carry these new forms of energy, spending $225 million building generating capacity? Why don't we look at the history? That's what intelligence agencies are supposed to do.
No, that's right. And again, what you described about what bin Laden was saying, what fueled his original hatred towards the United States in the early 90s, did apparently emanate from Saudi Arabia. But there was, as far as I saw, he has not hit the World Trade Centers because of the U.S. oil policies. I mean, he hit it because he hated the United States. He had declared jihad against the United States.
Why? Everyone. Because he hated our freedoms?
Yes.
Really?
He hated the Western way of life.
Really? Do you think that's really why he didn't like people buying flat-screen TVs, and that's why he bombed us? Because that's not what he said. That's what George Bush said. George Bush said he hates us for our freedoms. But he never said that. Osama bin Laden said he bombed us because we had boots on the ground in the land of Mecca. That's what he said. So I don't know. Do you have some special information that says he hated us for our freedoms? I mean, I know he believed that our culture was decadent, but, he believed lots of nations were decadent. Why did he bomb the World Trade Center? It's because, and he made this clear in his statements, on Al Jazeera. I'm doing this because they have boots on the ground in Mecca and because CIA policy has been, and U.S. foreign policy has been not to spread democracy, but to protect the mercantile interests of U.S. corporations. And that's what Osama bin Laden said.
Yeah, no, that's right. That's what he said. I mean, honestly, I would not take Osama bin Laden at his word about anything. As I say, I'm sure. And he did have this hatred. Part of the hatred would stem from the U.S. history you just cited. But all indications, all intelligence, I mean, his hatred was more inchoate and more visceral than that. He attacked the United States because he hated everything the United States stood for. It was the great Satan. Oil was only, frankly, a relatively small component of what he did. I mean, if that were the case, why didn't he attack in Saudi Arabia?
Well, he did attack Saudi Arabia. He was expelled from Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, in the early 90s, right.
Right. And and that's because he was regarded as a threat to Saudi Arabia because that was his primary target until we put boots on the ground in Saudi Arabia, and then we became his target. John, thank you so much for joining us, and thanks for engaging in this spirited debate. John Rizzo is author of the new book, Company Man, 30 Years of Controversy and Crisis in the CIA. Thank you so much, John, for joining us.
Thank you, Bobby.